to this session about the infamous nexus, and specifically how more coordination between humanitarian development and peace actors and efforts can help prevent famine. I'm Hiba Ali, CEO of The New Humanitarian, and I will be your moderator. La séance se déroulera principalement en anglais, mais vous trouverez de l'interprétation sur votre écran en bas à droite. Et pour ceux dans la salle, comme j'ai dit ce matin, il y a des casques dehors. Comme je ne sais pas comment traduire le mot nexus en français, je vous laisse me dire après qu'est-ce que les interprètes vous disent. The nexus, it has become the subject of many jokes, memes even, and endless panel discussions in the humanitarian sector. But is it real? And I can tell you that at the New Humanitarian, we have spent a lot of time, especially in the early days, trying to understand the nexus. I'd say even years after the World Humanitarian Summit, where the idea was conceived and took shape, few people understood what it really meant or if it had really changed anything. I think now that picture is beginning to change, and we're starting to build an understanding of how it's working. For starters, I think we've got something of a definition that humanitarian development and peace policies work together to link emergency relief with longer-term solutions and tackling the root causes of conflicts and crises. But I prefer a definition that I heard from Hugo Slim, the former head of policy at the ICRC and a humanitarian ethicist. I quite like that term as well. He says the nexus is a deeply trying and exhausting metaphor, and it would be more simple to simply say whatever short-term action you take must have long-term objectives embedded in it. So always, in everything you do, think short-term and long-term at once. So I think that's progress, but I will say that this morning I did hear from a member state that I still don't know how this nexus works. I know what it is or what it's supposed to be, but it's still not clear how it actually is supposed to work on the ground. So the goal of this session is, and this is perhaps a high bar, to explore how a nexus approach can work or is working to prevent famine and more effectively address food security and malnutrition. And hopefully we'll have an opportunity to hear some examples from the ground about best practices, also about challenges as the nexus has been piloted in different contexts. You're probably going to hear some of these numbers again during the session, but I think it's useful to set the scene. In 2021, 161 million people were in need of food assistance around the world, 41 million of them in emergency levels of food insecurity. And that's, as we know, a drastic rise from just 2 years ago, driven in part by COVID-19, but now getting worse as a result of the conflict in Ukraine, which is driving up wheat prices around the world. So now we're hearing that an additional 7.6 up to 13.1 million people are estimated to become undernourished in addition as a result of what's happening in Ukraine, but also that the cost of responding to needs is increasing due to, as I mentioned this morning, increases in food and energy prices. So WFP, for example, is estimating that it now costs them $71 million more every month to do the same work than 2 years ago. So how are we supposed to deal with this rising hunger? And can we just keep throwing money at it and hope that that's going to fix the problem? Obviously not. We're already seeing WFP having to cut rations in many countries, and that was even before Ukraine made the situation worse. So taking a longer-term view on these food crises is obviously quite relevant, and especially in the context of food, where it's so very much impacted by systemic and structural issues, and because inequality and poverty are such drivers of food insecurity. But it's also a sector where there is a lot of programming, a lot of money being thrown around, and so thus opportunity for perhaps a little bit more coordination, and a clear need, as I've already noted. It's also a space in which I think we've seen some increased political momentum in recent months, with a couple big summits on food and a number of new policies like the European Green Deal and its farm-to-fork strategy that are signaling at least some appetite at a political level. So if we can say the food sector is ripe for the nexus, but is it happening? There have been a number of pilots, guidelines developed. The EU now has a network of nexus focal points. As we once joked in the New Humanitarian, there's all kinds of, we didn't joke, we ran an algorithm that pulled up titles of people in the humanitarian sector, and there were all kinds of interesting job titles that involved the nexus. But despite those kind of signs of progress, it remains slow going, and it's coming up against inertia, egos, a drive for self-preservation. As one EU official put it, there's prime interest in every system to preserve its own existence. That means resisting change, and that is the main stumbling block to the nexus. So I hope our speakers today, Axel has already encouraged us to throw away our speaking notes and just say it as it is. So I hope you will help us understand where the nexus has been successful and why and how, and where it hasn't and what's been holding it back. We'll hear from a few people in the room and online. I'll ask a few follow-up questions, and then we'll take some statements from the floor. But throughout, we will be taking questions from the audience on Slido. So if our colleagues can throw up the slide to pose a question, and you can already start doing so now, you just visit sli.do and put in the code EHF-A490 to enter questions, and I'll try to weave them in as I can. So with that, we're going to kick things off with a video message from European Commissioner for International Partnerships, Jutta Urpilainen.
Dear friends, the war in Ukraine is unraveling into a humanitarian crisis. The consequences are felt far beyond Ukraine's border. Just in West Africa, Russian and Ukrainian wheat accounts for 30% of all wheat consumed. Even before the pandemic, we struggled in eradicating hunger. Today, nearly 1 in 3 people in the world does not have access to adequate food. In times like this, partnerships are increasingly important. In the next 7 years, the EU will allocate 300 million euros to sustainable food systems, nutrition, and agricultural practices. We have an integrated approach. For example, our Sustainable Cocoa Initiative with Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. We will reduce child labour, tackle deforestation, and ensure a living income for cocoa farmers. Friends, the humanitarian development peace nexus is key. We have piloted this approach in 6 countries. In Chad, the EU delegation and ECHO established a nexus task force with external partners. Actions focus on the immediate response to food security needs and the local production of enriched flour. In Haiti, after the earthquake in August 2021, we mobilized 10 million euros through the EU Emergency Toolbox. We support the agricultural relaunch in the south, complementing emergency assistance to the winter agricultural season. Friends, drawing best practices and lessons from these experiences, we are now expanding to other countries. Humanitarian and development approaches will definitely make a difference if and when working together.
So that was European Commissioner for International Partnerships, Jutta Urpilainen, who couldn't be with us today. But we do have a number of people in person, and I'm going to first turn to Mariam Ketir, Belgium's Minister for International Development Cooperation and Major Cities Policy. From the perspective of an EU member state, what do you think we have learned from past and ongoing crises about the nexus, and where do you see the kind of scope for inter-European action on this?
Thank you for the question. And let me start by your first remark that there has been a lot of jokes about the nexus. And what is the nexus? It's now more than 1 year that I'm Minister of Development Cooperation, and I have learned a lot of very expensive words like comprehensive approach, nexus. And then I said, okay, can you tell me what is nexus? And they said, yes, it is just important that humanitarian aid, development, and peace work together. And I said, okay, but how do we do that? And they said to me, nobody really knows. And I said, okay, let's try to see then how we can achieve those 3 topics together. And for starting, Belgium has decided to work with 14 fragile countries, and we are working with the most poor countries. That is a political choice. That means that the challenges to achieve the nexus is more complex, because often you don't have a partner to speak with. But at the same time, I think we have achieved in the last year to reach out a nexus. But for beginning, I think it would be more clear if everyone is having the same view about what is nexus. And from my point of view, I want to raise 2 examples where we try to do it. For example, last year I visited Jordan and Lebanon, and the topic was the humanitarian aid about refugees. And I think we support our humanitarian partners. And when we spoke with the people over there, they said, okay, we had food. We had the opportunity in the refugee camps to go to school. But now I'm at a point that I did everything what I could do, and the humanitarian aid from our side stops, but there is no development, and there is no peace at their country to go back. So, and there stops it. And so we're supporting the Madad funds to see how we can give them the opportunity that all the things that they have achieved to build out their lives further, so that there would be a cooperation with the private sector in the country, and to give the people an opportunity to find a job, and to all the things that they have learned to reach out their work. The second example that I would like to share is the example about the climate change. I think also the war in Ukraine is challenging us again. The food insecurity is already very big in the world, and when we see the prices, how who are expanding a lot because of the crisis, I think the challenge will go bigger. But also there you see that the nexus is very important. We started a climate program in the Sahel region, and there we said, okay, let's put on the topic of gender on priority. Let's try with our agency enable to find once with the people are ready to provide, that the people know how to react when there is no rain. Because when we teach them how to react and to, hoe zeg je dat, je land vruchtbaar maken? Fertilize your country, fertilize your soil. Once you learn people how to react to that, you make them more resilient. But at the same time, when you have your products, someone has to buy them, and to see how you can gain some incomes. And so we try to do it also with our climate program to find a nexus so that everything comes together. And I just mentioned it to my colleague on my right side that I also believe that development cooperation is getting more and more important. What I noticed is that some people are saying, oh, development cooperation, that is the last thing. We always say we need some diplomatical solution for the wars and for the crises that are going on. And in the meantime, development cooperation will do what they do. But at the same time, what I see on the field is that we are making the real changes. And diplomatical solutions are taking a long time. And there are other people who are responsible. But what I've learned is that the real change is coming from from bottom up, and that means that you have to make the people more resilient so that you could achieve a real solution on long term. Like you said, it's not only important to take actions that are achieving results on short term, but it's very important to take chances on long term. So I will stop over there, just to these two examples from Belgium.
Wonderful, and I love the fact that you're just speaking without notes, so that's beginning well, music to my ears. Just to pick up on your last point, about diplomatic solutions, in the end, all crises are political, and we can't really say that even just throwing, the humanitarians like to say we need more development cash, but actually throwing development cash at things isn't going to solve the problem either. It ultimately, Ukraine, Myanmar, Afghanistan are not going to be solved by the nexus. So how much does political capital cost?
Yeah, but I think that the word for the politics is comprehensive approach. So that means that the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Development Cooperation, and the Minister of Defense has to work together. And in the meantime, it is my responsibility to make sure that we don't leave the people behind. Because while other people are trying to find a political solution, in the meanwhile, the people are affected by the war, by the food insecurity, by not being safe. And I think there is where we come in. And not leaving them behind and supporting in them will be in the long term much better than say, okay. Because what I sometimes notice is when there is a discussion and they say, okay, we need to give a sign. Let's give a sign through development cooperation. And then I said, sorry, no. Development cooperation is over there and humanitarian aid is over there to make sure that we are there for the people and give them the first help that is needed. Because to react on a crisis, you have to be well prepared. And Belgium has decided to use 60% of their humanitarian budget to flexible funding. And that means that we don't wait till there is a crisis, and that makes our partners ready that in time when there is a crisis, they can act immediately. And I see that other countries are not doing that. And I had several discussions with bilateral discussions about that. And do you know why some countries don't choose it? Because when you wait till there is a crisis and you say, okay, I will support now, you get a flag.
More public attention.
And the humanitarian partners are saying, okay, this and this country has supported us now, while the other countries has chosen for quality and they got not attention. But for me, the quality is more important than the attention, and that's why Belgium has chosen to spend 60% of the humanitarian budget in flexible funding to give the partners the flexibility to react immediately in time of need. So the both are together, and in the meanwhile, we have to do what we can. While we know that some diplomatical solutions are taking a long time, but they are needed if we want also structural solutions.
And that coordination between the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and yourself, is that happening?
Yes, we are having very good cooperation. For example, in Niger, I have I started a new partnership with Niger. The defense, our defense is over there. Our development, the foreign affairs is over there, and we had several cooperation and negotiations together to see if the steps that we are taking are incomparable with the steps that my colleagues are taking. And I think people have to work more together and to see more together what is the step that I take, what does it involve your work or not, and are we looking at the same direction, and is there something that we need to change so not to interrupt each other.
Thank you. We'll have a chance hopefully to come back to the Minister later in the conversation, but I'm going to turn now to virtually, so you'll see him on screen, the Director General of the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, Sue Donu. The FAO is a founding member of the Global Network Against Food Crises, which actually brings together humanitarian and development organizations working to combat food crises to adopt a nexus approach. I think He will tell us a little bit more about how they do that, but in short, it's really sharing information so that all players have the same risk analysis of food crises and coordinating their work in the field. So, Dongwoo, over to you to tell us a little bit about perhaps how that UN approach to the nexus in the area of hunger and malnutrition is working and the role of the global network against food crises in that endeavor.
Thank you, moderator. I really agree with Minister of Belgium. You know, the UN system also, we have a different role for different organizations, and the mandate also different, but we have to work together. You said the nexus. Nexus in Chinese, we say guanxi. So you have to define the different close relationship among the three aspects. The recent trend in both chronic and acute food insecurity are alarming. Outbreak of the future is grave. Despite the sustainable investment of both humanitarian and development assistance for agricultural food assistance, nutrition interventions, both chronic acute food insecurity are rising. So first, I think a clear message, we wanted to produce more with less. We can produce more with innovation, improve the productivity, and there's less input, and less impact on the environment. But now, due to the pandemic and natural disasters, climate crisis, and also man-made crisis, conflict in Africa, in Near East, and now there's in Ukraine. So I think that's really, you know, we have to look at the issues of what the fragility of global food systems and agro-food systems, and also rural development is really urgent to be addressed. First, I agree with you, we transform agro-food systems to make them more adequate, more resilient, more inclusive, more sustainable. That's a little long and the middle term, but as you said, we also need a more urgent reaction. Urgent reaction from point of view of agro-food systems. We need more seeds, more input like fertilizer or even agro equipment. So those kind of things we need also to let the people, farmers back to the field, to produce more food by their own. And especially during past 2 years pandemic, and also you need more farmers locally produce their food first. And when you talk about the, at the different levels, globally and regionally and nationally, first, I think we need more political commitment. Because political commitment is from the top leaders, very important, because they can, for the agri-food system and the rural development, not only production, and also supply chain, and also logistics. And so it's not simply for the food alone. And luckily, last year, the UN Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, hosted the UN Food Summit, and the FAO now is playing a leading role to take the follow-up action, to coordinate all the, the follow-up actions together with our sister agencies. And at the same time, also, we need more address on the peace and humanitarian issues, because the people are suffering. They need first aid, stop the bleeding, like you have a wound on your arm or your fingers. But once you stop your bleeding and first aid, and then you need also to help them to build up the resilience and the capability to develop more, and of course the peace and stability as a preconditions. So for that, I think FAO willing to play the decisive role based on our own mandate. First is policy consultation. Second is capacity building, technical assistance. Third is the development of agri-food system and the rural areas. And last but not least, the information sharing. So through the innovation and the digitalization and the global networks, it's bringing all us together. So like my sister agencies, WP and others, we have a very close cooperation. And collectively, we can minimize the risk, and we can help the vulnerable people as much as we can. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much. You said the global network brings you all together. I'm curious how well that works at the field level, and where you might be running into challenges in terms of coordination between, say, FAO and WFP on the ground.
Yeah, but first, I think for the RBS, we are on the headquarter level. We need a policy dialogue and strategies, coherence. And at the country level, FAO, we operate more than 160 countries. So we are largest coverage organization of the UN professional specialized agency. So we always encourage my colleagues and the FAO representatives at the country level have more close cooperation, let's say WFP, EU, and others. And because they are limited, especially WFP and the IFAD, they have maybe 40, 50 countries have an office. So that's, as FAO, we are leading organization. We should take that initiative first. Second, also, we build up the integrated team to work together. First, nowadays, and FAO have a largest operational team in Ukraine during past 10 years even. So we have to support each other. And the third, I think, of course, we can share some, for instance, Afghanistan, we share all this facilities there because the WP and they have a lot of facility in Afghanistan, in Ethiopia, or in Yemen. So I think work together, and also appreciate also support from EU. They offer some resources to support FAO have low-cost control in East home areas during past 2 years. So avoid the double crisis, natural crisis from the locust and also from the pandemic. So I think from strategy to the action, from the business model to the deliverable action, we have to work together.
Encouraging to hear the head of a UN agency saying that, because it's not always the case on the ground. But I just have one last question for you, because I know you have to leave us early. And you talked about the relationship with WFP, which is, of course, a humanitarian agency. I wanted to talk briefly about the peace side of things. And we'll hear later from Interpeace, which has some research that finds that actually humanitarian assistance, including food aid, can actually increase violence at times rather than mitigating it. So I'd love to just hear about how you're factoring peace into your programming, and perhaps, does food really bring peace?
Yeah, food first. Make clear, food is a basic human rights. Everyone, no matter you have to have food. Second, I think for peace, it's very different root cause for different conflict. Some Sahara. I heard some news from the previous talks. Sahara region, some conflict due to the land or water and the natural resources conflict. And some, of course, different area, different country, different members, they have different root cause of the conflict. And then if I address most cases, except the military operation, but also most cases is also due to the natural resources conflict. For that aspect, I think a policy, enabling policy for the members, and also how to help them to get the more rational use of the natural resources and by the land right and so on. So all this related policy also is very important. So if we can offer some kind of, I said, policy consultation to contribute to the peace building up.
Thank you very much, Mr. Su. And I don't think we'll have a chance to come back to you, so good luck with what you're moving on to. I'm now going to move on to...
Because I have another bilateral meeting with the president of Lebanon. So I'm sorry.
You're meeting with the president of Lebanon. Okay, very well. Good luck.
Talk with them, political commitment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to turn now back to our in real life audience and to Axel. Axel, I think it's best you pronounce your last name because Van Trotzenberg. But these names look easy, but often there's a trick involved. But he is the managing director of operations at the World Bank, which has been active on this issue with many programs relevant to food and nutrition and infrastructure, social protection schemes, etc. Can you tell us a little bit about the role of financial institutions in this whole food nexus approach and what you at the bank are doing?
Well, I think the nexus is what I think is the organizing principle should be that whether you deal with humanitarian or with development, it's ultimately also about poverty. And I think this is a good organizing principle to think about is why do we do this? And then everything can follow from that. And I think we need to keep in mind that if an organization like the World Bank has as its main mission poverty reduction, and then you see that there has been successes, but also failures and setbacks. And the setbacks are particularly in fragile states. And there is this cumulative effects that where fragility is, we are also seeing a lot on food insecurity. There's a whole correlation of this. So I think we need to also to see that in these organizations, we have gone through I'd say a thought process, maybe for a far too long time. We, as an international community, compartmentalize the problems. Here is humanitarian, here is security, here is development. And it took basically till the end 90s a little bit that this is very artificial and not very helpful. And it started breaking down. And I think since then, actually, there has been also this increased involvement of the World Bank in fragile states, to the extent that now a third of our fund for the poorest, IDA, is actually going to fragile countries. And it is also for good reason. First, because there is an increasing concentration of poverty there, and actually extreme poverty will probably account for half of the total worldwide extreme poverty in fragile states. So it's imperative that one is involved in this. So that is one part of this. The second part is that particularly in fragile states and when we are seeing crises, humanitarian assistance cannot be equated as a development strategy. And I think that is one of the biggest dangers is that we say, well, we need to help, absolutely. But there is also a need, and certainly where the World Bank comes in, is that we need to think of the longer term. You need to think about ultimately development. And I think that is sometimes forgotten, and it is a strategic mistake. And therefore, I think we have to have much more this debate on how we engage, particularly when things go wrong. There are a couple of things what we need to think about, and there are unfortunate or uncomfortable things to be discussed. Think of this of Afghanistan. So then there is the change in August. The world community supported the country with massive resources. The World Bank with the ARTF, the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust, had financed 80% of the health system. Then comes August and it stops. Then it doesn't need a star analyst to know that this is a problem. And so we have gone through stages. There are, of course, hard feeling that people don't want to have the contact with the Taliban, but at the same time, Afghan people are hurting. So here is where we need to start thinking what kind of forms of collaboration with the Afghan people can be constructed. We have done that in a first step with the World Food Programme, with UNICEF. And actually, we went now to the board in March with a $1 billion proposal to work on education, health, community-based development, and agriculture. And then basically use UN agents and international NGOs to see how we can work together, particularly if you're thinking about food security. There is the thing that is man-made, that there are climate change-related things and then also weather-related stuff. But basically, I think if you know that it's man-made partly, then you can influence it. And for example, you will need to maybe give Afghanistan a chance to have at least some production, some agricultural production. So therefore, we have been working also with the FAO to see how you can get seeds there. So I think we need to really think also hard that when things go wrong in countries, how you can stay engaged, and particularly in the community level, so that actually the country can have access to food. And it cannot be only through food aid. You have to look at the production. And therefore, I think it is so imperative to think of clearly the link with the longer-term development. Another important link that we haven't discussed for is, of course, the security-related link, that here we need to think how we can help countries. If you look at the Sahel zone, how much insecurity is now dominating the entire discussion. And then you can talk about food security, you can talk about education. Almost everything becomes secondary because basically that part has not been resolved. So I think we need to rate. And then the even longer one is, of course, the climate change effect, where you see countries that have normally actually were not the producers of CO2 emissions are getting the double whammy that they are disproportionately affected by climate change. And so here, what we as institutions have to realize is we need to continue an engagement with all these countries, despite the fact that it's difficult, and maybe because it is difficult, we have an obligation to stay and keep on trying to see how we can best forge coalitions. In my mind, this is a call to think differently. Not only that one is only one part in a bigger puzzle, be it then you to work with bilateral, be it with the multilateral institution, UN, but also others like the ICRC, or you have also international NGOs, you have CARE, Save the Children, all the things. I think the organizing principle should be effectiveness, and that we can actually reach the target population. Because this is one of the things where I think sometimes everything gets caught in the international politics, that you cannot do anything anymore. In fact, you can do something.
But I want to push back a little bit, because you gave the example of Afghanistan, and basically, what the bank did was move money into humanitarian aid and freeze the assets that were sustaining the kind of long-term government operations. That's not exactly the nexus, right?
Oh, wait, but look, there are different steps. First is in August, then you have to reestablish among an international community who have very strong views about engagement or non-engagement. So you have to get actually the whole happy family in there, which is a task in itself. Secondly, there is a winter, and where you needed support. So nobody pretended that, for example, the 280 million that we provided in December was anything but humanitarian. Now we have said we actually need to look at how you can get kids or girls into school, how you can get actually a health care system, or keep on running that, as well as in the agriculture. What you are trying to do is to actually put the elements for a longer-term dialogue and longer-term development.
But I think in several cases, and Afghanistan is one of them, but Myanmar, Sudan are others, where as you said, when things get tough, the World Bank has stepped away from some of that work on root causes.
There is a board with the shareholders. So there are things that you can do and you cannot do. And so that is the tension that you are facing on this. I would say that it would be good to have actually more degrees of freedom to basically deal with non-government actors and provide funding. that funding probably would need to be on grant basis, not loan basis. Personally, I believe that it's doable, but politically, many of the shareholders are not there.
That, we always come back to the same challenges, right? The political will. And Miriam, we might have some more questions for you about that later. Thank you, Axel. I'm going to turn next to Karen, who's sitting next to me, Karen Holzhoff, who is the Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF. Obviously, we're trying to come at this issue from many different perspectives. The World Health Assembly has set very ambitious targets to reduce malnutrition by 2025. Give us your view on the role of the nexus in achieving those targets and a bit about where UNICEF is at in that journey.
Thanks so much, Heba. I'd like to thank also ECHO for bringing us all together. It's not every day that we are in person in a panel and we have the kind of persons in the room and the organizers and all of us together. So big thanks. This topic brings us together, and it's in fact quite a sad topic. It's a toxic moment, I would say, in history. If we have COVID-19, we have conflicts that we thought would never happen again, at least not in Europe. Climate change, poverty, inequity. So even in countries that are better off, we still have a lot of disparities within a country. And that has a toll on children's lives. So we see stubbornly high rates of malnutrition. Millions are surviving on very poor diets. We see wasting always there. And wasting is the most severe and deadly form of malnutrition. And it's on the rise. So who would have thought 5 or 10 years ago that we would still have wasting and so many children suffering from it? And it's really this humanitarian crisis is the worst for children. Conflict and also economic shocks, they weakened national food, health and safety net systems. And that is also what we are seeing now around the world. And that's resulting in an astonishing number of people slipping into catastrophic food insecurity, really things that we thought would soon belong to the past. We are faced right here, right now. So the latest figures, and you mentioned already some, it's 44 million people in 38 countries at the risk of falling into famine or famine-like situations, unless they receive really immediate life-saving health, nutrition, safe water, hygiene, and sanitation services. So the slightest shock will push them into famine. If you're borderline, one more shock, and that's it, you're into famine. And that means widespread mortality, especially among children under 5. So these multiple crises, they are deteriorating not only where we are now, but also hard-fought gains over the last couple of decades. So we have seen in Afghanistan and countries in the Horn of Africa that the worsening economic, environmental, and also political challenges are reversing progress. So we were seeing progress in these countries for the longest of times, years in a row, but now we are seeing these countries sliding back. In 2020, over 45 million children were suffering from wasting. And we fear that due to COVID-19 and the conflict situation, this will increase by 9 million children by the end of 2022. So that's a devastating backslide if we look at very recent progress that we had in fighting malnutrition. So today, challenges, I think, provide a unique window of opportunity to protect and uphold the rights of the child. And I know I speak for an audience here that is probably looking at it from a similar angle, but it is the time to get together and to achieve the global nutrition targets. The World Health Assembly targets, and you were asking about that, Heba, that these are agreed by all countries around the world. So it's not rocket science. We are committed to achieving those. And those targets are 30% of all children not being stunted, 70%, but 30%, less than 30% of the children being stunted, and less than 5% of the global child population wasting. So these are ambitious goals, but with the right commitments and investments, we know we can get there, basically. In the last 2 decades, we have seen a huge improvement in the nutritional status of children, and we saw a staggering 30% of all children not malnourished. So, and that resulted in 20 million children now growing up today stronger and healthier than 2 decades ago. So there is good news, and we know what needs to be done. When it comes to wasting, that remained unacceptably high during all these decades. So while stunting has improved, wasting has stayed stagnant. At the current pace of events, that World Health Assembly target will probably not be reached. As I have some numbers, I will only look for the numbers on my notes. So we know what works, and whatever works, we also know it's not reaching the youngest, the poorest, and the most vulnerable. So there we need that those children remain our focus, because they are excluded often from mainstream service delivery systems. And that is why we see that wasting is still so stubborn. There are 4 things that we can do together. And I'm happy that there is a little bit of a probably lessons learned exercise that we can project right in the future when we look at the horizon of the World Health Assembly targets. First, we need to continue investing in strengthening national systems, especially food, health, social protection, water, hygiene and sanitation. And we need to continue working with national governments, because there we find the answer, and we can support that answer. And these national governments, they should make available the social safety net, livelihood opportunities, as well as expanding access to education and primary health care. And we should also challenge the food systems to identify opportunities for food fortification. I think our colleague of FAO also was talking about food fortification, which is really important. Secondly, I'm already over time, I see better approaches to protecting services, expanding them in situations of severe food insecurity and famine. That's what happened with drought, for example, is there. And UNICEF, we work both in development and in humanitarian context. You were asking about the nexus. And I think the nexus is there where we can strengthen humanitarian assistance and development, and we use existing systems to expand when we have a humanitarian crisis. Third, and I will go a bit faster now, in context of conflict, we see we are constrained with that. We see population displacements, and the scale of complexity of challenges in conflict settings is different from, for example, drought. It's a rapid onset, and UNICEF and its partners like European Commission, World Bank, CARE, SAFE, bilaterals, UN agencies and others. There what we need is flexible funding, and you were already referring to it. The faster we can react, the better we can also keep existing systems in place. There is a pilot program that we do together with the European Commission, and that is in the Horn of Africa. It's a strong investment in preparedness and climate change adaptation, and that supports the rapid response as needed. Fourth and last, we need collective action alongside financial investment. So it goes beyond food delivery and food supplies. Yes, that's needed, but we need to prioritize those that are in the biggest need, and we need to come together to get pre-arranged financing, so humanitarian and development organizations like UNICEF, like international NGOs, can mobilize those resources quickly, before a devastating and irreversible damage is done. Exactly. We did not coordinate our remarks, but it is in the same line. And in closing, I would say I like you all to take home a message of opportunity. By working together, we can make really a lasting difference between life and death for vulnerable children across the globe. And together we can protect and expand the gains made in child nutrition. So we set the path to end malnutrition for good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sorry for overtime.
I'm just going to ask if the person sitting at the very back there, you'll see behind you a white jacket and a black bag, and in it there are some cough drops. And if you manage to bring it up, maybe we can give them to the minister.
I have them, thank you.
Okay,
she's sitting in a room with Ergo.
She's got some cough drops. Okay, great. Thank you. Karen, I just wanted to ask you if, and I haven't given her heads up on this question, so I don't know if you'll be ready for it, but in 2019, UNICEF, or actually the Development Assistance Committee of, oh my goodness, we've got liquor on stage now.
Now I'll go.
The Development Assistance Committee of the OECD adopted a bunch of recommendations on the nexus, and you are one of 7 adherents to those principles. And I wonder how that has changed the way you work, if at all, in terms of joint risk analysis or prioritizing prevention or strengthening local capacity, which are among the recommendations.
So in the onset of a humanitarian disaster, whether it's drought or conflict, we will, as UNICEF, always look first what is on the ground, what is existing, and what it is that we can build on. So we always like to scale, expand with the existing actors so that we avoid to have parallel systems. At times it can be faster to just bringing a lot of people and do it quickly, but then there is no sustainability and also often hardly any quality control. So we like to work, if possible, with national governments, local respondents, local communities, and whoever is on the ground. And what we have been pushed by all of you in this room and many who are not in the room is to be always more predictable and faster. And that is only possible if you have pre-arranged financing mechanisms in place, because that allows you to gear up very quickly. At UNICEF, we are always a bit concerned about quality and what we leave behind. If I think now about Ukraine and the massive influx of children coming into the neighboring countries of Ukraine, at this moment, Romania is already doing a triage, but others find it a little bit more difficult because of the massive numbers. So that means that children may cross the border and we don't know exactly their status. And we also don't know if they're separated from parents or not. We don't know their names sometimes, even health system, nutrition, specificities. So we like to do with quality, fast, and with locally available partners.
And you mentioned, I think it's always important to understand what are the blockers. So Axel, you talked about the challenge of shareholders having certain ideas about how money gets spent. And here you're talking about the need for prearranged financing. There are a number of questions coming through on Slido, which was why I wanted to get you the cough drops, because I think they're mostly directed at you regarding financing. One of them says that one of the key problems with achieving the nexus is finance, and that humanitarian response plans are completely underfunded, and that leaves the furthest behind. That leaves the furthest behind. Another says, how can structures and modalities within governments be put in place for a smooth transition in funding so that organizations, kind of to the point you made, Karen, can quickly switch between humanitarian and development interventions without losing momentum? So from your perspective as a donor government, that does have that kind of flexible financing in place, how can others do that in a way that allows for a quick reaction?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. They are very good questions, to the point. It's not easy. When we see, for example, a everything has to go fast, and people are getting impatient. And the situation is often also too serious to waste time. If I can give an example of Ukraine, for example, we have seen a huge wave of solidarity, and people wanted to help. And for us, government, it is important to work with partners that we know, and not with individual actors. Certainly, when we see the crisis of Ukraine, we are talking about lots of minor children and women. So the vulnerability about losing child or putting women in a situation that is not so safe, the risk is very high here. And we saw a lot of people who said, okay, we are impatient and the partners are not communicating what is needed, so we do it ourselves. And we saw a lot of people with lots of wagons go to the front, and they put the stuff like over there. Some of them also asked, can we get some children with us? And we told them, no, it's not possible. We cannot give you the children because we don't know where you will be ending, and we don't know you. So, and we try to explain to the people, our partners are important for this, because we know when we work with partners, we have the guarantee that the aid is coming to the people, and we have an security that the people are safe, and that we know how it will be structured. So working with our partners and local NGOs is, for me, as a Minister of Belgium, very important, because they are close to the people to understand that. That's why I mentioned also the flexible funding. If we want them and to ask the local NGOs and the partners to be ready and to be quick and to stand there and to take the responsibility, we need to give them the opportunity and the tools in their hands. And that is why flexible funding. And I'm making a tour to talk with all the partners to say, please lose the way of working to flag one country and another, because it's not necessary. We are talking here about humanitarian aid. And Alex said it, when we are talking here about the nexus, we are talking about humanitarian aid and development, and sometimes they are very close to each other, but we must not forget, development is conditional. And humanitarian aid must always be unconditional. You must give the partners the room, the flexibility to do what they need, and they have to be neutral. So it's easy to say humanitarian aid and development, and sometimes they are getting very close, but it's important to also understand why are these two different things. So the funding is very important, but at the same time I see that we are losing, or the perception is changing a little bit about the partners. And like people are saying, you see, I went over there, I did it myself, and the partners didn't do that. That is something visible, but at the end, there is a lot of logistical work that has to be done to take all these clothes to the people. And who is doing that? The humanitarian partners are doing that. So people don't see all the logistical side, and now we will try to tell them, you know, financial help is needed, is the most efficient way to support the partners. But at the same time, I'm also trying to tell the countries, please spend more on flexible funding. So, because there are more crises, the crises are taking longer. Today we have Ukraine, but we also have Yemen, Syrian. We have a lot of other crises that are still going on, and the budget is not growing. So that's why we have to see, let's convince more partners, countries to spend in more flexible funding. But at the same time, I reach out to the partners to see how can we work more together. Because FAO, I visited, I have their book here with me, but I visited them in Senegal. If I can give you just one example. In Senegal, there is FAO worked with WFP, the World Food Programme, and there they helped people to restore their ground. And because they worked together, it was more sustainable. And now they left them, and the people said, okay, we will take this structure, and now we will put up the level higher for ourselves, but we will do it on our own. So partners need to work more together, more flexible funding, and convincing the people that the partners are important more than the individual actions.
Axel, I know you needed to leave a bit early, so if you do need to go,
I just wanted to say one of the things about when we are talking about flexible funding and contingent funding, this is one of that makes sense. However, there are tensions because governments have to have also their normal expenses. Similarly, with donors, when we are raising funds, to say where right now budgets are stressed, you say, look, we need actually contingent funding, that you say the Belgian taxpayer should provide money to the World Bank or the UN, and we say we will put that in a fund that is not being used right now, but for a rainy day. That is very difficult to explain when there is fiscal stress in countries. So there is this tension. We have, unfortunately, not the luxury of many choices. Everything is a hard trade-off choice. And so this has to be considered when flexibility and contingent funding is being considered. Flexibility is also that I think what you're seeing is also by a lot of donors that it gets increasingly earmarked, that goes totally counter to flexibility. So there are things that we need to think that if you want to be flexible, you will need to let go a little bit. And that is right now certainly not the trend.
Thank you. And there is another related question to financing. How can we reach the target population when we have chronic underfunding? Do we need to look meaningfully at how we fully fund humanitarian response plans? And I will, just to save time, go ahead and say, I think that's the point of the nexus, that the humanitarian response plans will never be fully funded, and that's too expensive a way to respond. And so the nexus is a response to that challenge. I'm going to turn to Sophia, who's been waiting patiently. Sophia Spreckmann-Cinero, who is the Secretary General of CARE International. And as I mentioned in the introduction, there were two big summits last year, linked to food systems that both called for a strengthened nexus approach. One was the UN Food Systems Summit, the first ever, which led to a number of commitments to tackle food crises, and the other being the N4G pledging conference. Can you talk us through a little bit what you think needs to happen for all these kind of policy commitments that have been made to actually result in a difference on the ground, and CARE's role in that?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Heba, and thank you. I'm really honored and very pleased to be with this very esteemed panel. CARE, as a dual mandate organization, works in some of the most fragile contexts all over the world, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, and many more. And of course, we embrace the humanitarian development and peace nexus. Yet times are truly very, very tough right now, very, very tough, and the pressure on food security is enormous, and we see hunger looming all over the world. And Karen, you mentioned the toxic cocktail of COVID and climate change, of course, compounded by COVID now, and inequality and inequity. So all of this is causing, of course, millions of people to be truly hungry, marginalized, discriminated against. And the latest figures on Yemen, I think they're probably top of mind for all of us right now, where hunger for many people in Yemen is not only vivid, but undeniable and hopefully avoidable, but I'm not sure, because it's truly critical right now. You mentioned all of these summits of last year, the UN Food Systems and Nutrition Summit, G7 commitments, and I think the implementation of these commitments must happen now and must be accelerated. And of course the question is how? And maybe the conflict in Ukraine right now must not only be in our hearts and minds, as it obviously is, but now I think more than ever, this must really lead to urgent and very, very concrete action. And that is what it is about. I want to mention maybe four concrete points for action that I want to highlight. And first and foremost, maybe not foremost, but definitely first, because without it we won't be able to make any progress. We need more funding. We need more funding, and $5.5 billion are still needed.
Can I just stop you right there? Because
yes.
We need more funding is like what everyone is going to say in every single session, and we know what the reality is. So then what?
Yes, but it's funds actually to support frontline responders. Frontline responders, because it's not just any funding, but also how it's not just spending the resources, but truly working with especially women-led and women's rights organizations who truly understand what the needs are, and they need this funding in order to provide meaningful and appropriate response. Because I also think, with all the damage that COVID has done, it also has meant that not only responsibility has been given to frontline responders, because we couldn't fly in and out, very fortunately, also much better for the climate, but also more authority has been given to women's and women's rights organizations, and they really know what is mostly needed. Do I dare to say that the compartmentalization into humanitarian development, peace, is also underpinning to all of that, is really the attitude, I think, the very colonial attitude that, we know better what is good for them, that they know. And
is that to say that if more money was channeled to local and women's-led organizations, that you would be able to better fight these food crises than otherwise?
I strongly believe so.
So it's not necessarily more money, it's just money channeled differently.
More money, but also the quality on how it is spent is absolutely critical. And I think, women and the gender dynamics of food insecurity and hunger cannot be denied. Girls are often the ones that drop first out of school. Women are often the ones that eat last or least at home, and even more so in the light of the pressures we are viewing right now. So I think, yes, and they are also, the world's farmers that are now, of course, in a very dire situation. So if we don't grasp those linkages between food insecurity and hunger and the gender dynamics behind that, everything we do is short-lived. I think that compartmentalization that we have seen is truly problematic, but it, again, underpinning those attitudes that that have prevailed in our sector for decades. There's many reasons for that, and that's why it's so hard to change for all of us, all the international NGOs, because it's hard to shake off what we've done for so long and are known for, and that has prevailed in the sector. There's also pressures in our context, in our societies, for rather than the deep tissue work, rather than very short and quick solutions. That's often what the public wants to hear. And of course, also from donors, the anti-terrorism policies and other policies also are our main blockers. So I do think that, now in the context in which we are living, there is an opportunity to work very, very differently with women-led and women's rights organizations that truly understand the context and can respond in a very meaningful and deeper way to looming hunger and food security.
In more of a nexus way also?
And more of a nexus.
That's a genuine question.
Because, most of the organizations, the women's rights and women-led organizations we work with, they don't think. They're actually in nexus terms of like peace, humanitarian, and long-term development. That's often a reality imposed by us, because that's not how they operate. We work mostly with partners that really work on all fronts in a very deep and connected way. And of course, all of this is very context specific, and and the analysis of risks, of gender dynamics, and that's very critical in this very context, to actually do deep risk analysis and deep rapid gender analysis to understand the underlying dynamics. So I think much of this has been imposed by outside.
Thank you. I'm conscious you probably had more points to make, but I appreciate you holding off. And Minister, I'm going to come back to you. I'm just conscious of the time. We have 15 minutes left and a few perspectives that I would like to draw from the floor. And then we'll do a last round in which we can hear some final remarks. So I'm going to actually move to the lectern so that I don't awkwardly make you guys come stand here. And then whoever comes up can just take the hot seat. How's that? And I'm going to start with Jean-François Riffaut. Is he here? Yes, hi. Come on up, Jean-François. He's the CEO of Action contre la faim, and he's going to tell us about some mechanisms that already exist or can be leveraged or reinforced. Yeah, please. 10 minutes, of course, yes. You will deal with the crowd.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yes, I'll try to make it short, one or 2 minutes. I would like, 2 minutes it's here. No, I'd like to insist on one thing which has not been said so far, I think. It's the political will. Of course, we need money. I support what you say. We do need money. We do need better money. We do need more coordinated money, but we also need political will to change things. If there is no will to protect humanitarian space, no one of us and no one of local NGO will be able to reach out to people in need. So we have to find political will to protect international humanitarian law and to protect the access and the humanitarian space. But we also need political will in terms of being more understanding of the situation. We don't have to wait so long for a complete, comprehensive survey that would show that in the very specific province of such a country, there is a very specific rate of malnutrition. No, we do know. Every year, I'm here, and my colleagues, they are here, in the lean season to say we are entering the lean season, we will need to have more money, more commitment, etc., etc. So we'll need to have political will also to facilitate the work of NGOs, whether they are from the north or from the south, to have access to flexible funding to tackle the emergency issue of hunger. We need also political will, and I will end up with that, in terms of coordinating the approach. We have experienced, very positive experience, of food crisis prevention mechanism that we have in Africa, but there is also the will expressed by the G7 famine compact. It was talks, it was word said. It's not yet money on the ground. So we will need this political will strong enough to make nice words and nice vision being really traduced and translated into action for the sake of people. One last thing, if I may. I would like to insist, because I was discussing with my colleagues in Central Africa 10 days ago, and in terms of nexus, I think it's a very Western scene vision, if I may say, theory. It's interesting, it's very nice, it's good for us from here, but it does not a lot of sense for the same people who is in the morning receiving food support from a local NGO or for Action Against Hunger, and who is in the afternoon receiving a food security program coming from a development approach. So this nexus it has to be seen from the people's perspective. And in terms of that, we need long-lasting contribution to fight emergency, one word, because food crisis is a long-lasting crisis. And so we can't afford to negotiate whether it will be humanitarian funding or development funding. We need to have long-lasting emergency funding to respond to the crisis.
Merci, Jean-François. Are there any donors in the room apart from Belgium? I see 3 hands. Okay. So all these calls for funding are being heard by someone, I hope. Yes, 4 or 5. I'm next going to call on, merci Jean-François, and you can pass the mic to your colleague who will come up, Scott Weber, the president of Interpeace. We talked a lot about humanitarian and development nexus. The leg of this triple nexus that is often neglected is the peace side of things. And so, Scott, tell us why we should no longer neglect the poor peace.
Well, thank you, Heba, and it's nice to join you on the panel here. I must say the peace angle in the conversation we've had today was quite neglected, in fact. And we talked about how failure is not an option, which was the name of this panel, but the nexus is also not an option. C'est une évidence. It's evident, as our colleague from, I think, Action contre la faim said, and as you were saying from CARE, to the local communities, to a local Somalia, local Yemenite, or others. They don't separate, they don't do humanitarian assistance from 9 to 11 in the morning, and then a little bit of development until 3 p.m., and then a little bit of peace building from 3 to 6. For them, it's all intertwined in their lives, like a bowl of spaghetti. They can't separate it out. We create these siloed approaches and try to be relevant to such an integrated reality, a lived experience on the ground. And that is part of the problem, is that we're constantly, the nexus is a way of trying to retrofit our siloed systems to reflect the natural coherence of how people are living the problems. That's our problem. The problem is with us. Now, when you look at it, when I started in humanitarian assistance, and now I do peace building, of course, when I started in humanitarian assistance about 25 years ago almost, 20% of humanitarian crises were conflict related. Today it's 85%. 85% of what we are talking about in terms of humanitarian crises are conflict related. And yet, how much of a discussion was there today about the conflict or peace side of this equation? Very little. We are neglecting this. Most of the research that is done about this phenomenon is done about the fact that conflict creates food insecurity. But I can tell you from our experience, food insecurity also creates conflict. Think of the Sahel. In the eastern part of Mali, western part of Burkina Faso, northern part of Côte d'Ivoire, that triangle region, that cross-border region, the local conflicts around land and grazing rights, etc., creates tensions in the communities, which has ballooned into conflict. Now you have extremist groups exploiting those divisions, are coming down from the north into the south of those countries. And now they're exploiting those problems and creating what is probably going to be a massive food insecurity crisis as a result. But it started because of land management and food issues at the local level. It didn't start because of extremism. So we're getting this wrong. We have to actually study, if we want to be serious about prevention. We have a great partnership with FAO. It was great to see the DG here, looking precisely at how to prevent famine and food crises by working on the underlying developmental and peace-building issues that are giving rise to the insecurity in the first place. So when we talk about what to do about this, there are a number of different issues. If you look at the really good performers, those leaders either in the UN or whatever agency or organization that are really making a difference, they tend to be trilingual. These tend to be people who in their careers have done development work, peace-building work, or political work, and humanitarian work. And they understand instinctively what our friend Hugo Slim was rightly saying, that whatever you do, be it humanitarian, be it development, be it peacebuilding, needs to have the same long-term goal, which is the self-reliance and the cohesion of the communities you're working with. If your engagement, short-term humanitarian assistance, longer-term development or whatever, isn't building greater trust within the community and their ability to handle their own problems without us, then we're failing. That's the metric, is how much we are working ourselves out of a role. The problem is that if you think, again, I was saying the number of conflict, 85% of humanitarian crises are conflict-related, but 2/3 of the conflicts that we're dealing with today are protracted conflicts of 8 years or more. So you have the peace-building, development, and humanitarian workers all cohabitating the same context in 2/3 of the cases. So these are not sequenced issues. Let's stop pretending they are. We did an analysis, a systems analysis, of why humanitarian agencies have such great difficulty being consistent with the nexus thinking. Why? And it comes down to incentives and requirements. Anyone who does systems analysis knows that a system produces exactly the result it's designed to produce. Exactly. So if you want a different result, you actually have to change the incentives and the requirements of that system. Well, we talked a little bit about incentives with funding, but there are many more that we need to analyze and disrupt if we want to get serious about having a different impact. So it's a systemic analysis that we need to do and understand the incentives and requirements of that system that governs it.
Can I intervene, Scott? So are you suggesting that humanitarians have an incentive not to pursue the nexus because it's in their interest to just keep getting short-term funding?
No, I wouldn't go so far at all. No. I do think it's about aligning the understanding of one's role. I talk to a lot of humanitarian actors who think that their role, and they're recruited on the understanding that their role is to go and save lives. But actually, I would say that their role is not just about saving lives, but in the way that they save those lives immediately, make sure that you don't have to come back again. So it's not a cynical view, but it's about understanding, couching your short-term intervention in a longer-term perspective, exactly as Hugo said. I would say it a bit differently, but it's exactly that sentiment. And even humanitarian action needs to contribute to peace too. There are many cases, Galkayo in central Somalia, where we work, is a good example of how humanitarian aid actually triggered the last conflict there. So there are ways in which all actors, development, humanitarian, and peace building, need to understand. Doesn't mean they need to collaborate together. I think that's a misunderstanding of the nexus. And that's why humanitarians are so afraid of it, and rightly so. We need to protect our humanitarian colleagues and their humanitarian space. But they need to understand, those humanitarian actors, what's the footprint that they leave? Because they leave a footprint, a deep one. What's the longer-term footprint that humanitarian actors leave through their short-term intervention? And once you understand that, how would you do your short-term intervention differently to leave behind a better longer-term footprint on self-reliance and cohesion in society? That's the key. So it's not that humanitarians should become peace builders at all. They need to operate in their separate space, but using the same star to navigate as everyone else does, which is the longer-term self-reliance of society. And so everybody's role is about working themselves out of a role.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm collecting a list of descriptions of the nexus that we've developed over the course of the session. A bowl of spaghetti is one. Using the same star to navigate, and a Western scene theory. So keep those coming. I'm going to call up Eva now. Eva Svoboda, who is the Deputy Director of International Law and Policy at the International Committee of the Red Cross. Now, as you know, I mentioned this morning that there were a number of regional consultations in the lead up to the forum. There were also some side events. And Eva's going to tell us about one that also touched on this issue and bring back some of the key messages from there.
Thank you, Hiba. And I'd like to start with international humanitarian law, which was mentioned just before. And of course, as the ICRC, I would say this is a core of our mandate, promotion of international humanitarian law, which, when respected, protects civilians and humanitarian agencies during conflict. But we would argue that it can also help, when respected, it can help in the recovery later on. It can help in the long-term prospect when infrastructure is protected. So I think international humanitarian law is relevant, of course, in conflicts, but beyond. So respect for IHL and the humanitarian principles is really a necessary kind of element in the operationalization.
Musical chairs in the background here.
That's an important point. So IHL and the humanitarian principles, important in the operationalization of the nexus, where really we should be leveraging each other's expertise. And I think one paradigm we need to move away from is this during post-conflict. I think that's no longer the reality on the ground. So we need to kind of move away from that. It's a pre, during, post-conflict. So this was also a message during the side event that we had where UNICEF and the World Bank and the ICRC presented their report called Joining Humanitarian Development Forces to Respond to Protracted Crises. And 3 key issues came out. The first one is around, yes, respecting our differences in mandate, for sure, but then also finding creative ways to work together. And it is, again, building on each other's expertise. That's around also sharing of information, of knowledge. And I think this is a good illustration of how that could look like. It also means getting a deeper understanding on the realities of the ground, using the different perspectives. Then the second one is the consequences of conflict on basic infrastructure. So quite often when that is destroyed, then people don't just suffer because the infrastructure is damaged, but because the governance systems, the authorities, the structures that support these support people are not there, and so these pre-existing vulnerabilities come up. They're being exacerbated. So we have to start working with local actors, and that is my third point. It's around including local service providers. So it's not around just replacing them, but working with them on a longer-term thinking at the same time as we bring a humanitarian aid in. And again, one of the speakers before said there will be the need for that, this short-term, brief humanitarian aid, but it should not come at the expense of longer-term thinking and especially working with local actors and local systems. Thank you.
Can you just clarify to me, when you say IHL is important for the Nexus, what you mean?
It's important because when you respect IHL, then and that means respecting essential infrastructure, which is not targeted then of course you have to, you can start from a position where you don't have to rebuild everything, where you can use what is left in some ways to build on top. So you don't exacerbate what is already a difficult situation.
Thank you, Eva. I hope you're all enjoying this musical chairs. At least you get to hear many different perspectives. So we're going to hear 2 more perspectives from the floor, and then and I said 15 minutes, but my timing was confused. We have another 15 minutes, so we'll be wrapping up after that. So I'll call up Dr. Catherine Lorenz, who is the Director of Governance and Conflict at GIZ, and I hope will be able to give us some examples of projects that GIZ has been involved in on the ground where Nexus has been successful.
Yes, thank you very much. And first of all, congratulations to ECHO and the French presidency. And it's an honor for us as GIZ to be on this distinguished panel. And I'd like to, because also for time's sake, maybe echo 2 points that were just made by the previous speakers. I mean, first of all, it's really important to really do not look at before, during or after crisis. It's protected crisis, and when it comes to the Nexus, it's about the complementarity. It's about working together from different perspectives and not working before, after. It's not about humanitarian start and hand over. And this is also our experience. We have, in particular, since the WHS, been working more and more closely with humanitarian partners, among them also UNHCR and WFP. And our experience is that we are at the same time in similar places, and we use our strengths of organizations to actually make a difference in this long-term perspective. And the second point I'd also like to echo is the point about the P. And in other discussions, we've been talking about small p and big P. I don't know if you've been hearing about that as well. Of course, the big P being the high politics, so actually peace building, stopping a war. But the small p is looking into all our interventions and looking at the interlinkages between food insecurity, resource conflicts, local conflicts on the ground, community conflicts. So integrating a small p, a peace-building approach on the local level in all our actions when we work in crisis. And maybe this is something, of course, that doesn't solve big conflicts, but it is a matter of preventing further escalation on community level. And I think we should be much more clearer on that one. And it should move beyond conflict sensitivity, which I believe in 2022 should definitely be a given in all of our intervention, and really look into local peace-building potentials to prevent further aggravation of crisis. The experiences that we've been making with our partners, for example, have been with WFP in the Niger. We've worked with UNRWA closely, we've worked with UNHCR, and again, for us, the WHS has really been a great starting point to move from our developmental approaches more and more into this complementarity. Also thanks to our funders, in particular the German government, who have been actually pushing us and helping us in doing so.
Thank you very much. I'll just to keep you updated, in the Slido, I'm getting feedback on my list of analogies. So someone says, I like the spaghetti analogy. We can't mix it together and communities can't take it apart. Next, I'm going to call up, well, he's already here, Vincent, is it pronounced Steli?
Steli.
Steli, who is representing the European Humanitarian NGO Network Voice. Over to you, Vincent.
Thank you. So actually, through Voice, I mean, we have consulted all our members, and actually there's quite a lot of them, and we have released quite a comprehensive document, as to use a word, not so long ago on the Nexus. And I think some of the points that came out there, I mean, we talked already about it, the coordination, first of all. I think it's very important to have an active and effective coordination, because you can have coordination and do info sharing, but it's more than that. So we need to work on common objectives, putting the communities central to, and when I talk about the communities, the affected communities, putting also the attention to women and children inside of these communities. But also I think it's very important, and I think it was mentioned here before, that we cannot blur the lines, because we all have our roles and responsibilities as different actors. Humanitarian organizations, we are bound to the IHL, and we have to work with our principles that are very important, not only to protect the communities, but also our workers that are on the field. And I think it's very important not to blur them. We had already in the past enough examples where actually it brought in danger, I mean, even the communities where we work. I think also, and this was not mentioned enough. I think when we talk about famine, it's a very technical term and a very scientific. So let's include the academics on what is famine, and to ensure that the right terminology, the right indicators, the right methodologies to tackle them are used. I mean, we're using the IPC values and all of this, so it's very important to keep on doing that. But also, I think famine doesn't happen overnight. I mean, it's a whole process. And we know before that there's going to be a famine in one, or even a food crisis in one or the other countries. Now, when we think about the flexible funding, and when we think about prevention, we need to wait until we have a critical moment to get access to emergency funding. And the prevention side is forgotten, and I think there needs to be more attention to the prevention side, releasing more funds from development actors also, and development actors working much more to prevent the famine before it happens. Then, I mean, when the famine is there and when the humanitarian actors need to operate, I think having funds, and I'm happy to hear from Belgium, from Mevrouw Kittier, that there is already flexible funding here, but there are other donors also, like Sweden and others, that are working really very hard on this flexible funding. And I think it's important, because this makes us, or enables us, to really have an impact and have an effect actually on the situation.
Vince, can I just ask you one follow-up? You talked, because people often talk about in the Nexus, we have to be careful to protect the humanitarian space, but it's never clear to me what that looks like in real life. What is this example where, in fact, it did endanger your communities to take a Nexus approach?
But I think in the past we have seen already, I mean, let's look at the past and the quick impact projects, all these type of issues that were there. I mean, that actually blurs the line, and sometimes we as humanitarian workers, being either from a local NGO or from the international NGO, are often seen as political actors. And we need to have a trust with the community, entering the community and being able to connect with the communities. So I think we need to be very careful not to blur these lines.
Can you share what happened in that particular case, where the lines were blurred?
Yeah, I think often it's a security issue. It's a security issue for both. Either the community that works together, but that could be seen also as a cooperation with an international agency, and have a political stamp on it, or it can happen to the workers that are entering the community. So you have different ways to look at it.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, I'm going to call up Andy Catley, who directs the Policy and Process Research Program at Tufts University's Feinstein International Center. And he will tell us about a project to develop guidelines for agricultural livelihood support in emergencies called SEEDS.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Like most of us, I think I had a kind of 5-minute speech prepared. I'm going to try and improvise. What I'd like to talk about is humanitarian standards. And as we know, humanitarian standards, such as the Sphere Handbook and the standards in the Humanitarian Standards Partnership, are the point of reference, really, for many humanitarian actors, and are really the benchmarks for accountability and quality of humanitarian programming. And of course, they have a strong foundation in international humanitarian law, protection principles, and so on. So if we're talking about the nexus, we could ask the question, to what extent do current humanitarian standards support the kind of approaches that the nexus is trying to move forwards on? Better integration with development and so on. And I think what's interesting is that if we look back to the origins of Sphere in 1997, the language at that time around humanitarian standards was very much around saving lives. And that was the imperative of humanitarian action, I think. And then over time, perhaps late 90s, early 2000s, this phrase, saving livelihoods, started to appear in the humanitarian scene. And then the phrase, saving lives and livelihoods. And what's happened over time is that as more humanitarian standards have been developed and become part of the humanitarian standards family, this concept of saving livelihoods, I think, has become more prominent in some standards. For example, standards on market-based approaches and so on. We have a set of international standards on livestock interventions in emergencies. And those standards are framed around a set of livelihood objectives. They're not about saving human lives, they're about supporting livelihoods. They're about primarily delivering livestock-related assistance, but working with pre-existing market actors, communities, and so on, with long-term development in mind. And those standards have been available since 2009 and are constantly being updated. So that's one general point I wanted to make. I think there has been some movement in humanitarian standards over the years.
And what is your project helping to add to that?
That's my second point.
Wonderful.
You're way ahead of me. We've heard from the panel about the many millions of people who are affected by disasters right now. And of course, there are hundreds of millions of people around the world who are also at risk of disasters, of severe food insecurity and hunger and so on. And many, of course, of those people are small-scale rural farmers. However, despite the array of international standards that we have, so far, there are no international standards that deal specifically with crop-related assistance. Okay. So although we have many, many communities and people who are actually farmers, so far we don't have international standards for crop-related assistance. Hence, the new project, which I'll briefly talk about, which is called SEEDS, the SEEDS project. That's SEADS. And SEEDS is all about developing these crop-related humanitarian standards under the HSP. And in relation to the nexus, SEEDS is really follows a very strong livelihoods-based approach. Okay. So inherent in the SEEDS standards will be an emphasis on localization, working with pre-existing systems and actors, and delivering crop-related assistance that provides impacts during an emergency but also supports long-term development. So that's what the new seed standards will be all about.
Andy, I'm going to just ask you to wrap up if possible, because I think we're out of time and people are going to start streaming out.
Thanks. So anyway, the seed standards are in progress and will be published later this year. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry to rush you. In 30 seconds or less, do any of you have comments on what you've heard from the round of interventions? Maybe you can start with you, Karen.
I'd just like to return to my take-home message that I mentioned earlier, and that is opportunity. In times of crisis and conflict, and I think the COVID pandemic and all the crises that we have around the world is also a time of opportunity. So this is the time that we can agree to do things differently, and that's what I want to share with you. I do think malnutrition, we are on a path that we can end it together. We may not reach the 2025 goal on 5% wasting, but I think on malnutrition we can reach it.
I would hope that we're past the point of agreeing what needs to be done and actually doing it. But Sophia, your thoughts?
Yes, I think a lot has been said, and thank you for all the deep reflections. I do think that my takeaway, you won't be surprised, is that the true experts in the nexus are the organizations that, and there's really an abundance of those organizations everywhere in the world, youth and women's rights and women-led organization. They understand the dynamics more than often we do, and we must be led by them, and by them having full, equal, direct and meaningful access and participation in food security policy and decision-making, then we will make a dent on this food insecurity. We have no time to waste. We have no time to waste, and I think our support to them and being led by them is what really matters now more than ever. Thank you, Hiba.
Final words to you, Minister. So much of this conversation was about funding.
Yes, but I take home with me that we have a common goal. And it's more than about only raising the funding, and it is a coordination. And I just want to make one remark. I heard there is a need of a political will, and I think there is a political will that we want to do better and want to do it faster. But there is also a need from the partners to have an open view. Because I heard that, and of course, 2/3 of the people who are working are already doing the nexus without someone telling them, is this humanitarian, is this peace, is this development? They are saving lives, that's true. But it's our responsibility to look and to see how we do it the most efficient. We know that there are more crises, and if everyone is keep on doing what they are doing, we will not do better. And so I just wanted to be careful by saying it is our way of thinking, and we want to tell them how they do it, because I'm very allergic to that idea. I don't like it, but at the same time, I'm open to see how we can do better, and if the nexus can help for that, let's have an open conversation and not bother the people who are already doing it 2/3. We have the responsibility to look at the long term. How can we do better? How can we do faster in terms of peace, in terms of development, in terms of humanitarian aid?
Well, I must say that as someone who has listened to a lot of these discussions, I think it has moved forward. At the beginning, whenever you talked about Nexus, all the humanitarians were screaming, but our impartiality, our neutrality, or the donors were saying, but our parliaments won't let us do this or that. And I think we've come a little bit further along. We may not be at the point yet where this is happening at scale on the ground, to the point where people are able to come really tell those stories of concrete experiences. But it sounds like it's inevitable, as you said, Scott. We're going to close with a video from the voices, I hope I don't put you on the spot, IT, because I was supposed to play this earlier and completely forgot, of the voices of the people for whom this whole discussion is meant to, result in a better life and livelihood, as you put it. So as you stream out, you can have a listen to what they have to say and who this is all for. Thank you very much to the participants and to you, the audience.
في فئات في المجتمع كانت عايشة على مصادر دخل محدود، فتأثير الاقتصاد وتأثير الحرب عليها أدى إلى إنه هذه الفئات ما عادش قادرة توفر حتى قوت يومها.
صارت عندنا طبعا المشاكل الحرب، يعني تهجرنا 4 سنوات عن المخبز ورجعنا وللأسف المخبز مدمر. بعد الأسى والدمار طبعا اجتنا جمعية اوكسفام مشكورة، جمعية إنسانية بامتياز، فإعادة تأهيل المخبز من أول وجديد، فكان له أهمية كبيرة هذا المخبز بالحي وباقي الأحياء المجاورة.
Cuando hay lluvia, logramos la cosecha. Cuando no hay, pues no hay. Así como estamos pasando en estos tiempos difíciles.
There is a very high level of malnutrition rate, 52% of malnutrition rate in children. It's a province that really lacks already the minimum conditions to face a challenge such a conflict like this. Thanks to all the donors' contribution, and especially the European Union from WFP's side, we have been able to guarantee that displaced population have at least the minimum food needs every month.
Dahil nga po natutunan po namin sa DRR, sa mga training po namin, ang family ko po ay pag once na malakas na po yung mga ulan dito sa amin, ay namimili na po kami ng pangangailangan po namin na pag once na lumakas ang tubig, malalim na yung tubig, ay mayroon na po kami na may mga bigas na po kami, may mga ulam na po kami na naka-reserve na just in case malalim yung tubig, ay pwede na po kami magluto.
Thank you very much.